The wedding had cost more than most people earned in 3 years, and everyone inside the Grand Meridian Hotel ballroom knew it. The chandeliers alone, each one a cascading waterfall of Austrian crystal, threw prisms of light across the white marble floors, and the flower arrangements, imported roses in cream and champagne, stacked into towers taller than a man, perfumed the air with a sweetness that felt almost too deliberate, as though someone had tried to manufacture the scent of happiness itself. 500 guests in their finest clothes filled the rows of gilded chairs, every face polished with expectation, every hand holding a glass of something expensive and cold. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city glittered in the late afternoon sun, indifferent and enormous. But in this room, the world had been made small and controllable and perfect. Or so Victoria Ashford believed, as she stood at the entrance to the ballroom in her ivory Vera Wang gown, her dark hair swept into an architectural updo, her expression arranged into something between serenity and triumph. She had worked a long time to stand exactly here. Victoria had grown up in a modest split-level house in a suburb where the lawns were always a little too dry and the cars in the driveways were always a little too old. Her mother had worked nights at a hospital billing department. Her father had managed a hardware store until his knees gave out and then managed nothing at all. They were good people, kind people, the kind of people who said things like, "We don't need much to be happy," with such conviction that you eventually started to wonder if they were trying to persuade themselves or the world. Victoria had loved them in her way, but she had never believed them. She had sat at the kitchen table as a teenager and watched her parents move through lives that were small and carefully managed, clipping coupons, and choosing vacations based on gas prices, and declining invitations because the restaurant was slightly too expensive, and she had made herself a private and absolute promise. She would not live like that. She would not. The promise had become the engine of her entire adult life, the thing that had driven her grades and her social choices and her professional moves with a consistency that looked, from the outside, like ambition but felt, from the inside, like fear. She had always felt the gap between the life she had and the life she wanted, like a splinter lodged just beneath the skin, present at all times, never quite painful enough to force action, but always, always there. She had climbed out of that suburb on the strength of her looks and her intelligence and a talent for making wealthy people feel understood. And when she had finally reached the altitude she'd been aiming for all her life, she had looked around and decided the view was not yet high enough. Ethan Calloway had been the next rung on the ladder she'd been climbing since she was 17 years old. He was handsome in the way that money often makes men handsome. Not extraordinary on his own, perhaps, but surrounded by the right clothes, the right haircut, the right watch on the right wrist. He projected an authority that read as attractiveness. He had built his financial consulting firm from a solid inheritance and a genuine talent for numbers, and he moved through rooms full of powerful people with the ease of someone who had never once in his adult life worried about whether his credit card would go through. He was not unkind. He was not cruel. He was, if Victoria was being honest, somewhat distant, somewhat preoccupied, a man who loved his work more than he would ever love any person, but that suited her fine. She was not looking for someone to love. She was looking for someone to anchor her to the life she had always meant to live. The ceremony was set to begin in 20 minutes. Guests were still arriving, being guided to their seats by young men in white gloves, and the string quartet in the corner was playing something classical and unobtrusive. Victoria was accepting congratulations near the ballroom entrance, laughing softly at things people said to her, touching their arms with practiced warmth, when she happened to glance toward the far end of the room. And she saw him. He was standing near the back wall, a little apart from the nearest cluster of guests, holding a glass of water rather than champagne. He wore a dark suit that was well cut, but not extravagant, no tie, no pocket square, nothing that announced itself. He was looking around the room with quiet attention, taking it in the way a man takes in a landscape he recognizes but has not visited in a long time. Victoria recognized him immediately, in the way you always recognize the people who have seen you at your most unguarded, no matter how many years have passed. Marcus Webb. The recognition moved through her like a cold current, and then something else moved through her behind it. Something that wanted to be contempt, but had a little too much anxiety mixed in to be purely that. She looked at him for a moment, assessing, and what she assessed seemed to reassure her. He looked ordinary. He looked like someone who worked a steady job somewhere and drove a sensible car and ate dinner in front of the television. He looked, she decided, exactly like the kind of man she had been right to leave behind. And because she was nervous in ways she would not admit, and because there were people around her whose opinions she cared about, and because she had always found it easier to perform confidence than to feel it, she tilted her chin up and let her voice carry. "I don't believe it," she said, loudly enough that the 6 or 7 people nearest to her could hear. "Marcus Webb. At my wedding." She laughed, the kind of laugh that invites others to join in, and a few people glanced in the direction she was looking without fully understanding what they were looking at. "I haven't thought about this man in years," she continued, half to the woman beside her and half to the room. "He was the biggest mistake I ever made. I left him because he had absolutely no future, and looking at him now, I'd say I was exactly right." She shook her head with a smile that was performing amusement while conducting surveillance. "Some people just never figure it out, I suppose." A few guests laughed, uncertain but willing, the way people laugh when someone with social authority signals that laughter is appropriate. One woman near Victoria leaned in and whispered something sympathetic. A man in a gray suit said, "That takes nerve," showing up to an ex's wedding, and shook his head. Marcus, across the room, gave no indication that he had heard any of it, though the room was not so large, and the string quartet was playing softly. He stood with his hands loose at his sides, his expression unhurried, his eyes moving without apparent urgency from one corner of the ballroom to the next. His stillness was the kind that comes not from passivity, but from a long practice of choosing not to react to things that are not worth reacting to. It was the stillness of a man who has been tested by things considerably larger than social embarrassment, and it read, to the few guests who were paying close attention, as something stranger and more interesting than they had expected. Victoria waited for him to look at her. He did not. That bothered her more than she would admit. There had been a time when Marcus Webb had looked at Victoria Ashford as though she were the most important thing in any room she entered. She had understood that, once, as love, and perhaps it had been, in the way that the feelings of very young people are real but not yet fully formed, the way a seedling is genuinely a tree, and yet not yet capable of bearing weight. They had met in their mid-20s at a networking event for young professionals, back when both of them were still constructing their identities out of ambition and uncertainty in roughly equal measure. Marcus had been lean and serious, and funny, in a way that surprised you. The kind of funny that comes from someone who has thought carefully about the world and found its contradictions both absurd and beautiful. He had been working then on what he called his project, a real estate development initiative, focused on underserved urban neighborhoods, a combination of genuine idealism and genuine business sense that had seemed, to Victoria at the time, like the most romantic thing she had ever encountered. She had loved the version of Marcus that existed in possibility. She had loved the conversations they'd had at 2 a.m. about what the city could be, the way he spread blueprints across his kitchen table and talked about buildings as though they were arguments he intended to win. She had loved his certainty that he was heading somewhere, even when heading somewhere meant, concretely, a small apartment and a car with 140,000 miles on it, and dinner made at home because restaurants were a luxury they couldn't afford yet. The yet had mattered enormously to her in the beginning. It was only later, when the yet became a when, and the when became an indefinitely, that she had started to feel the splinter in her palm again, sharp and insistent, and had begun to wonder whether she was investing in a future, or simply waiting for one that was never going to arrive. Marcus had been pouring everything he had into the project. Every dollar he saved, every hour he wasn't working his day job, every fragment of energy and attention and intelligence he possessed had been directed toward this single, enormous effort. Victoria had watched the process with first admiration, then impatience, then a creeping resentment she had been ashamed of, but unable to suppress. She wanted a life she could inhabit now. She wanted the apartment with the high ceilings and the closet big enough to walk into, and the weekends at places that had spas. She wanted to stop telling people she was working toward things and start simply having them. She was 27 years old, and she felt the world moving past her while she stood still, and the person standing still beside her was Marcus. And at a certain point, she had confused her frustration with him for a verdict about him. "I love you," she had told him once, near the end, when the tension between them had become the primary atmosphere of the relationship. "But love doesn't pay the rent, Marcus. It doesn't pay for anything. I need someone who has something to offer me right now, not in some theoretical future." He had looked at her for a long time after she said that, long enough that she had thought he was going to argue, or plead, or try to renegotiate the terms. Instead, he had nodded, slowly, as though she had said something he had already known, but needed confirmed. "Okay," he had said. Just that. "Okay." And she had left. She had met Ethan 4 months later at a charity gala, and within a year, they were engaged. And she had not spent much time thinking about Marcus Webb after that. She had told herself the story, the way she needed it to be told. She had been practical, she had made the rational choice, she had chosen herself and her future over a man who was never going to give her what she needed. The story had held up for years, clean and self-justifying, and she had tucked it away in the part of her mind reserved for things she did not intend to revisit. But Marcus Webb was standing at the back of her wedding reception, and the story was vibrating in a way stories do when reality refuses to cooperate. The ceremony itself proceeded without incident. The vows were exchanged before an officiant who had a well-practiced voice and an expression of practiced serenity. Ethan held Victoria's hands and said the words he had prepared with the focused competence of a man completing an important transaction, and she said hers, and the guests applauded, and the string quartet swelled into something ceremonial. Through it all, Ethan was present, but distracted, in the particular way Victoria had learned to interpret as stress about business, the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his focus kept sliding somewhere she couldn't follow. She had seen this particular brand of distraction many times in their 2 years together. It was the look he wore when a deal was unsettled, when numbers somewhere in his firm were moving in directions he didn't like. She had learned not to take it personally. She assumed it was the quarterly numbers. It was often the quarterly numbers. What she did not know was that from the moment they entered the reception hall, and Ethan had turned to greet the assembled guests, his eyes had found Marcus Webb standing at the back of the room, and something in his chest had contracted so sharply it had felt, for a moment, like a physical blow. He had blinked. He had looked away and looked back. The man was still there, still standing with that same unhurried stillness, still holding a glass of water, still looking around the room with the calm attention of someone who is observing rather than being observed. And Ethan Calloway, who had made a career out of keeping his composure in high-stakes situations, had felt the composure slip in a way it rarely did, because the man standing at the back of his wedding reception in a dark suit with no tie was not simply a guest he hadn't expected. He was the man Ethan owed everything to, in a way that no one in this room, including, and especially, the woman who was now his wife, knew anything about. The drinks reception moved around the edges of Ethan's consciousness, like water moving around a stone. He spoke to guests, he shook hands, he accepted congratulations, and all the while, some part of him was tracking Marcus across the room, the way you track a door you're not sure is locked. He saw Victoria notice him. He saw her face change the brief flicker of recognition, the recalibration of her expression into something harder and more performative, the way her chin came up, and then he heard, with a clarity that cut through the ambient sound of 500 people in a marble ballroom, the words she used to describe the man who had saved Ethan's life. Loser, no future, biggest mistake. He watched the people around her laugh, and he watched Marcus not react, and something turned over slowly in his chest, like a page being turned in a book he had thought he understood and was discovering he had misread entirely. He was aware, as he watched this, that he was learning something important about his wife. 4 years ago, Ethan Calloway's consulting firm had walked to the edge of a cliff. He had made a sequence of leveraged investments in a commercial real estate fund that had subsequently collapsed when 3 of its anchor properties had failed to secure the zoning approvals they'd been banking on. The losses had been catastrophic and cascading, each failure pulling at the ones beneath it the way a thread pulled from a sweater eventually unravels the whole shoulder. He had done what he could, called in every favor, renegotiated every contract, sold every non-essential asset, and had still arrived at a morning when his CFO had sat across from him with spreadsheets that amounted to a verdict. Without a significant capital injection within 45 days, the firm was finished. Not struggling, not difficult, finished. No bank would touch him. His personal network, people he had hosted at dinners and taken to games and considered friends, had found urgent reasons to be unavailable. His father, from whom he had hoped to borrow as a last resort, had told him with genuine regret that his own liquidity was tied up in ways he couldn't quickly undo. Ethan had spent 2 weeks making calls that went nowhere, and then, with 31 days left on the clock, a message had arrived through an intermediary. A private investment firm was interested in reviewing the situation. The meeting was brief and very different from the meetings he was used to. No performance, no salesmanship, just numbers and plans, and frank assessments of what had gone wrong and what could be recovered. 2 weeks after that meeting, the capital arrived. Clean, structured, with terms that were firm but fair, and an explicit agreement of non-interference in operations. The firm that had provided it had a name, Webb Capital Advisors, and the person behind it, Ethan had learned, was its founder, a man who kept a very low public profile and conducted his business through a small team of trusted associates. Ethan had tried, at the time, to arrange a meeting to express his gratitude in person. The response he'd received had been polite and brief. The investment speaks for itself. No meeting necessary. Best of luck with the rebuild. He had rebuilt. The firm had not only recovered, but grown, and in the years since, Webb Capital's stake had been bought out at a substantial return. Ethan had always carried the sense that somewhere out there was a man he had never properly thanked, a man whose judgment and willingness to act when no one else would have been the difference between Ethan Calloway's success and a very different kind of story. He had looked up the name once or twice, but found almost nothing. A functional website, a sparse LinkedIn page, no interviews, no profiles, no presence in the financial press that liked to celebrate its stars. Just results, quietly accumulated, and a privacy that seemed not like shyness, but like deliberate choice. He had not known what Marcus Webb looked like. Until now. When Ethan stepped toward Marcus across the reception hall, Victoria's voice following him with sharp confusion, "Ethan, what are you doing? Security can handle this." He was aware that the world was reorganizing itself into a shape he had not anticipated and could not yet fully see. Marcus turned as Ethan approached, and his expression was polite and unrevealing. A man prepared to receive whatever the groom had come over to deliver, good or bad, with equal equanimity. "Marcus Webb," Ethan said quietly. "That's right," Marcus said. "Webb Capital Advisors." A pause, brief but complete. Marcus looked at Ethan carefully now, the first time his attention had sharpened since he'd arrived. "You know the firm," he said. It was not quite a question. "I know the firm," Ethan said, "because 4 years ago your firm was the reason I still have one." He kept his voice low, and his face had gone through several things in rapid succession. Surprise, recognition, something that looked like it might become emotion if he let it, and he was not, at this moment, entirely in control of himself. Callaway Financial. The commercial real estate exposure. 2019. Marcus was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was measured. "I remember the deal," he said. "I've been trying to figure out how to thank you for 4 years," Ethan said. "I didn't expect to meet you like this." "I didn't expect to be here like this either," Marcus said. And there was something in his voice, a faint and perfectly controlled note of something that might have been wry irony, though his face gave nothing away. Victoria, watching from 20 feet away, felt the ground shift in a way she couldn't explain. She had expected Ethan to escort Marcus out with cool civility. She had expected the ordinary social mechanics of a host managing an uninvited and unwelcome guest, and instead she was watching her new husband stand in quiet, urgent conversation with a man she had publicly called a loser not 40 minutes ago, and Ethan's body language was all wrong. He was not managing the situation. He was in it. He was engaged in a way she had never seen him engaged with anyone who wasn't directly relevant to his professional life. She felt the first small, cold drop of real anxiety fall through her chest. She crossed the room. She inserted herself between them with the smile she kept for situations requiring social control. "I think there might be some confusion," she said brightly. "Marcus, it was very surprising to see you here. Ethan, love. Can we—" "Victoria," Ethan said, and the way he said her name stopped her. It was not unkind, but it was different. It was the voice of a man who has just learned something that changes the map he's been using to navigate. "Give me a moment." She gave him a moment. She gave him several. She stood at the edge of a conversation she was not included in, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the particular discomfort of a room that was not organizing itself around her. When Ethan turned back to the assembled guests and asked for everyone's attention, the expectation in the room was warm and anticipatory. A toast was coming, people assumed. Something heartfelt from the groom on his wedding day, the kind of speech that would be photographed and quoted and remembered. The string quartet fell silent. 500 faces turned toward the small, elevated platform at the front of the room where Ethan now stood with a microphone in his hand and an expression that was harder to read than the situation seemed to call for. He began by telling them about the worst year of his professional life. He told it plainly, and without self-pity, the bad bets, the collapse, the phone calls that went unreturned, the spreadsheets that said it was over. He told it the way a man tells a story he has carried for a long time and is finally putting down somewhere, with care, but also with relief. The room grew very quiet. This was not the speech anyone had expected, and the unexpectedness of it was holding 500 people in a stillness that felt almost like suspension of breath. And then Ethan said, "When every institution and every person I trusted had closed their door, one person opened theirs. An investor I had never met, operating through a firm with no public profile, who looked at my numbers when my numbers were terrible and decided the underlying business was worth saving." He paused. "I spent 4 years wanting to thank that person properly. I didn't think it would happen like this." He looked up from the middle distance where he'd been directing his words and looked, clearly and deliberately, across the room. "Marcus Webb saved my company," he said, "and I would very much like everyone in this room to know that." The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. Heads turned. People looked for Marcus, found him near the back wall, still standing with his glass of water, and looked again with different eyes. The recalibration was visible, collective, and rapid. A few people near the back, business people whose world overlapped with finance, had gone very still, with expressions that suggested the name had arrived somewhere in their memory and was still completing its journey to full recognition. Someone, somewhere in the room, opened a phone. Then another phone. Then several. Victoria did not open her phone. Victoria stood very still, with a champagne glass in her hand, and felt the floor she had been standing on for the last 20 years shift and tilt and reveal, in its tilting, that it had not been solid ground at all, but a surface she had constructed from her own certainties, and that her certainties, it was turning out, had not been certainties at all. Marcus Webb had not disappeared into the ordinary life she had always assumed he'd settled into. Marcus Webb had spent the years since she left him being quietly extraordinary. Webb Capital Advisors managed a portfolio worth well over $2 billion. It was the kind of firm that never advertised, never sought press, was known only within the circles that had reason to know it known, in those circles, as the firm that took the calls no one else would take, that moved with patience and precision, that never got it wrong in any way that mattered. The foundation Marcus had established bore his mother's name and had funded clean water infrastructure projects across 3 countries. He had done all of this without a single profile in a business magazine, without a television appearance, without a Twitter account or an Instagram presence, or any of the mechanisms by which successful people in the modern world announce themselves to the world. He had simply worked and built and given and remained himself. Victoria found him near the garden entrance, where he had been moving slowly toward the door, in the way people move when they are ready to leave. but do not want to make a production of it. She touched his arm, and he stopped and turned, and for a moment they stood looking at each other, in the way that people who have shared something significant look at each other after enough time has passed for the significance to be seen clearly. "Marcus," she said. "Victoria," he said. She tried, for a moment, to find the voice she usually used in difficult conversations, the controlled voice, the voice that managed situations. It wasn't there. What was there instead was something rawer and less practiced. A woman looking at a man she had sorted into the wrong category a long time ago, and finding that the sorting had revealed more about the sorter than the sorted. "Why didn't you say anything?" she asked. "Tonight, when I said those things about you, why didn't you?" She stopped. The question was incomplete, because the completion of it was too uncomfortable. "Why didn't you correct me? Why didn't you humiliate me the way I humiliated you? Why didn't you use what you have to make me feel as small as I tried to make you feel?" Marcus looked at her for a moment before he answered, and his face was not cold, which somehow made it worse. It was the face of a man who has arrived at peace with something, not through indifference, but through hard work and clear sight. "Because I don't need to prove my value to someone who already decided I had none," he said. His voice was even and quiet, and the words landed with the weight of something that had been understood for a long time. "What you said tonight, Victoria, that wasn't about me. It's never been about me. It was about what you needed to believe, so the choice you made felt like the right one." She had not expected that. She had braced for anger, or for the cold satisfaction of someone who has won and knows it, and what she got instead was something that felt alarmingly like clarity. She opened her mouth and then closed it again. There was nothing to say that would not make it worse. He was right, and she knew he was right, and the knowing of it opened something up in her chest that she had kept very carefully closed for a very long time. The understanding that she had not left Marcus because he had failed. She had left him because she had been afraid that his dream was too fragile and her need was too great, and she had translated that fear into a judgment so she wouldn't have to sit with the fear itself. She had called him a loser because it was easier than admitting she was running away from something she could not control. "I didn't love you the way you deserved," she said. The words surprised her as she said them. They were true. "No," Marcus agreed, simply. "You didn't." She felt tears move into her eyes and pushed them back, because she had earned them, but had not earned the display of them. "Not here, not in front of this man." "I'm sorry," she said. Marcus nodded once, the acknowledgement of a thing received, not a pardon issued. "Take care of yourself, Victoria," he said. And then, because there was nothing more that needed to be said between them, because the thing that had needed saying had been said, finally, decades late, in a hotel ballroom full of witnesses who hadn't been listening to this particular conversation, he turned and walked toward the door. Ethan watched him go. He had been standing near enough to see, if not to hear, and what he had seen in his wife's face during that brief exchange had told him things that her face had never told him before. He had married Victoria because she was beautiful and intelligent, and because she understood intuitively the world he moved in, and he had told himself that their marriage was a partnership of equals who had chosen each other with clear eyes. He had never paused to ask whether she was capable of the kind of generosity of spirit that a person needed, in the long run, to be genuinely kind. He had never asked, because the question had never presented itself with any urgency. Tonight, it had presented itself with nothing but urgency, and the answer was sitting in his chest like a stone. He thought about what he had seen. He thought about the ease with which she had laughed at Marcus, the pleasure she had taken in it, the way her contempt had required no pause for consideration, as though sizing up a person's worth was something she could do instantly and confidently, on the basis of a vest and a quiet manner and a glass of water. He thought about the way the people around her had laughed along, following her lead without needing to understand why, and how natural it had all seemed to her, how unremarkable, as though this were simply what you did with people who didn't belong in your space. He thought about what Marcus had actually done with his years, and what that said about the speed and confidence of Victoria's judgment. He thought about how she had looked at Marcus when she hadn't known who he was, and how she had looked at him after, and how the difference between those two looks was not really about Marcus at all. It was about her. It had always been about her. And he thought with a clarity that was almost physical. If Marcus had walked in here poor, if Marcus had walked in here as exactly what Victoria had assumed he was, would any of this feel different? Would she be any less wrong? He knew the answer. He had known it the moment he'd watched her laugh. Outside, the city was doing what cities do in the early evening, filling with lights, filling with the sound of traffic and voices, indifferent to the small dramas unfolding inside its buildings. Marcus Webb walked through the lobby of the Grand Meridian Hotel without hurrying, past the marble pillars and the flower arrangements and the young men in white gloves, past the guests who were still arriving too late and would never quite understand what they had missed, past the valets and the revolving door, and out into the air, which was cool and carried the faint smell of rain still somewhere over the horizon. He stood on the steps for a moment and looked at the street. His phone showed 3 missed calls from his associate director and a message about a deal in negotiation in Austin that required a decision by morning. He looked at the message for a moment, then put the phone in his pocket. The deal could wait 10 minutes. He had lived his entire adult life, making decisions quickly and well, and he could afford 10 minutes to stand on a hotel step in the early evening and let the night settle around him before he went back to being the person he had learned, slowly and at great cost, to be. He thought about Victoria, but not with the anger that had once lived in that space. The anger had been real. Once he had not been a saint about the breakup, had not been immediately peaceful, had gone through the full inventory of grief and bitterness, and the particular humiliation of being told by someone you love that you are not sufficient. He remembered the weeks after she had left, when he had driven to work in silence and come home to an apartment that was too quiet in a way it hadn't been before, and had sat with the specific and terrible feeling of having been weighed and found wanting by someone whose opinion had mattered to him more than he'd realized. He had eaten badly and slept irregularly, and spent a month being a diminished version of himself. And then one evening, late, working on a revised version of the project proposal that had by then already failed once, he had looked up from the numbers and realized that the anger had quietly exhausted itself while he wasn't paying attention to it, and what had replaced it was something lighter and more useful. He worked his way through all of it the hard way, not by suppressing it, but by feeling it until it had nothing left to say, and what had come out the other side was not indifference, but something cleaner. He understood now that Victoria had been afraid, and that her fear had found its expression in judgment, and that people who were afraid and who had not yet learned to sit with their fear did things like this. He had done his own things like this, in his own time, in his own ways. He was not exempt from the charge of having been cruel to people when he was running from something. He had simply been lucky enough to do most of his running in private. The project, when it had finally come together, not the first version, which had indeed collapsed under the weight of bad timing, and an investor who had disappeared with funds that weren't his, but the second version, rebuilt from scratch with harder-won knowledge and better-chosen partners, had been the thing that changed everything. Not because it had made him rich, though it had done that, gradually and then decisively, the way certain kinds of progress work. Because it had shown him that the version of himself he had been trying to build when Victoria left him had been real, had been worth building, had been worth the years of difficulty and failure, and the particular loneliness of solitary work in apartments where the heat didn't always work, and the Wi-Fi was borrowed from a neighbor, and the only people who believed in what he was doing were a small handful of individuals who had seen enough of his character up close to trust that the rest would follow. He had needed to believe, when she left, that she was wrong about him. That need had driven him in ways he was not always proud of. He had worked too hard and slept too little, and made decisions out of anger that he later had to revise, and he had spent too many nights measuring his progress against what he imagined she was doing, rather than against what he actually valued. And then, as the years passed and the work accumulated and the proof arrived in forms too substantial to deny, he had discovered that he no longer needed to believe it. He simply knew it. And the need to prove anything to anyone, to her, to the people at her wedding, to the room full of expensive clothes and rented certainty, had dissolved somewhere in the accumulated weight of everything he had built and done and given when no one was watching. He thought about Ethan Calloway. He hoped the man was going to be all right. He seemed like a decent person who had perhaps not yet had occasion to look carefully at the person he'd chosen to stand beside. He had seen enough of Ethan in those brief minutes of conversation to understand that he was not a bad man. He was simply a man who had selected a partner on the basis of criteria that had not included asking whether she was fundamentally kind. It was a common enough mistake. Kindness was one of those qualities that tended to be invisible until it was tested, and the tests didn't always come in time. Tonight's test had come with interest, and publicly, and Ethan would have to decide what to do with what it had revealed. That was not Marcus's problem to solve. He had enough of his own. But he hoped, genuinely, that the man would make the right choice, not the easy choice, not the socially convenient one, but the right one, the one that required him to look at what he'd seen tonight with full honesty and act accordingly. Occasions like this one had a way of arriving eventually, and what a person did with them was the thing that mattered. Marcus had done what he could. He had shown up, which he supposed he owed to a relationship that had mattered once, and he had let the truth be whatever it was going to be. And now, he was standing on a hotel step in the early evening, and the city was arranging itself in lights below him, and he was, as he had been for a number of years now, fine. He was more than fine. He was a man who had been told he had no future and had gone out and built one, slowly and carefully, and without anyone's permission, without a mentor who believed in him from the start, without the cushion of family money or institutional backing, or the confidence that comes from having been told your whole life that you were the kind of person things worked out for. He had worked in obscurity for years, been turned down by investors who couldn't see past the neighborhood he was trying to build in, been told the numbers didn't pencil out by people whose pencils were pointed at the wrong metrics, been dismissed and overlooked, and once, quite deliberately cheated by someone he had trusted too completely. He had taken every one of those experiences and done what you could only do with them if you were the kind of person whose identity did not depend on other people's assessment of it. He had turned his face toward the work and kept going. He had treated failure, not as a verdict, but as data, not as a conclusion, but as a course correction, not as evidence of what he was, but as information about what he still needed to learn. There was no secret to it, he knew. There was no moment of transformation, no single decision that had changed everything. There was only the accumulated weight of small choices made correctly over a long time. The choice to get up when it would have been easier to stay down, the choice to learn rather than blame when something failed, the choice to extend trust carefully, but genuinely, the choice to build something real rather than perform the appearance of something real. He had made these choices not because he was extraordinary, but because he had decided, early and with full awareness of the cost, that they were the only choices worth making. He thought about the line he'd said to Victoria, about winning his life on the day he stopped trying to prove it to her. It had come out right, he thought. He had not planned it. But it was true. He took out his phone, called his associate director, and spent the next 15 minutes discussing the Austin deal in the cool evening air, while the city moved around him and the lights came on one by one in the towers overhead. He made the decision that needed to be made, clearly and without wasted words, and ended the call and stood for another moment in the silence. Inside the Grand Meridian Hotel, the wedding reception was presumably continuing, though no one who had been in that ballroom when Ethan Calloway gave his speech would ever quite describe the evening as having gone according to plan. Victoria was somewhere in there, navigating a situation that was going to take years to fully understand. Ethan was somewhere in there, sitting with a new and uncomfortable knowledge about the woman he had married today, figuring out what that knowledge required of him. The 500 guests were in there, some gossiping and some thoughtful, and some already composing the story they would tell about what they had witnessed. The story of the man who had been laughed at and had turned out to be the largest person in the room. Marcus Webb walked down the hotel steps and into the street, and turned left toward the parking garage, where his car was waiting. And the evening closed around him, as evenings do, without comment, without ceremony, without announcement. The city did not know or care what had happened inside that ballroom. The world was exactly as large and indifferent as it had always been, and Marcus moved through it as he had learned to move through it. with purpose, with patience, with the quiet and undemonstrative confidence of a man who had made his peace with himself a long time ago and had not found it necessary to revisit that peace since. He walked without hurrying. He did not look back at the building. There was nothing behind him worth looking back for, not in bitterness, but simply because the thing that had needed to happen had happened. And Marcus was someone who understood the difference between a chapter that was finished and one that was merely uncomfortable. This one was finished. He reached his car, got in, adjusted the seat the way he always did, and sat for a moment in the quiet before starting the engine, looking at the concrete wall of the parking structure and feeling, as he often felt at the end of days that had required something of him, a kind of steady and uncomplicated gratitude for the life he had been stubborn enough to build. There is a kind of person the world tends to underestimate. It is not any particular type, not any particular race or background or presentation or manner of dress. It is simply the person who is not yet visible, the person whose work has not yet accumulated to the point where the world can no longer ignore it. The world has a habit of deciding, on insufficient evidence, that certain people are finished, that their dreams are too large, their resources too small, their origins too unremarkable, their manner too quiet, their suits not expensive enough, their glasses not champagne. The world makes these decisions with great confidence and remarkably little accuracy. It makes them in ballrooms and boardrooms and break rooms and sidewalks and dinner parties and every place where human beings are sizing each other up with the crude instruments of surface impression. And the people it writes off go on to do what they were going to do anyway, and the world adjusts its story after the fact, and the adjustment is never acknowledged and never apologized for, and the people who were dismissed and dismissed and dismissed again are expected to be gracious about all of it, which most of them are. Because grace, the real kind, the hard-won kind, the kind that survives being told you are nothing and emerges on the other side still intact, is a quality that tends to be distributed more generously among people who have had to develop it than among people who have never needed it. The truth about Marcus Webb was not that he had been hiding something. The truth was that he had been building something in the only way that things worth building can be built slowly, privately, without fanfare, through 1,000 days that felt ordinary, until the accumulated weight of them finally revealed the shape of what they had made. He had not been proving anything. He had not been preparing a moment of revelation. He had simply been living his life at full intensity in the direction of his own values. And if that life had eventually grown large enough to make someone else's words about it look small, that was not his doing and not his goal. It was simply the consequence of a man not stopping when people told him he should stop. He had not stopped. He had never stopped. And in the end, the city that had watched him drive to a wedding reception in a dark suit with no tie, the same city that had watched him walk out of it an hour later, without fanfare, without anger, without anything needing to be said that had not already been said, that city was indifferent to all of it. But the people who had been in that room when the truth finally arrived, unbidden and unannounced and impossible to dismiss, would carry it with them for a long time. Not as gossip, though some of them would gossip about it tonight and tomorrow and for weeks afterward, over dinners and phone calls, and the particular pleasure that people take in witnessed reckonings. But beneath the gossip would be something that couldn't be dismissed with the gossip, something that sat a little deeper and lasted a little longer. The particular kind of memory that changes slightly, the way you look at people you have decided, too quickly, too certainly, that you already understand. The memory of a man who had stood quietly in the back of a room full of people who dismissed him, who had absorbed their laughter with stillness rather than rage, and who had walked out leaving behind a silence that had more to say than anything that had been spoken all evening. Sometimes the person standing quietly in the back of the room is not waiting to be seen. Sometimes they stopped needing that a long time ago, and they are simply there, present, complete, already arrived while the rest of the room catches up.